Her father was called a failure. His reputation was destroyed. His greatest map was deliberately left unfinished. But hidden inside a leather crate, his daughter found a secret that shattered everything she believed and unlocked the one weapon that could defeat an empire. Stay with me. This story will change how you see courage. Like, share, and subscribe so stories like this keep finding you.
The sun beat down on the Cimarron border. It baked the red dirt until it was hard as iron. Clara Whitmore stood in the center of the trail. The dust coated the hem of her dark riding skirt. Beside her stood General. He was a 20-year-old gelding with a graying muzzle and knees that had seen too many miles. And right now he was at moving, not a single inch. Clara held the leather reins in her gloved hands. She gave a gentle, steady pull toward the west. That was the direction her father's map dictated. General planted his hooves. He tossed his heavy head. He refused to face the western scrub brush. Instead, his ears swiveled. He turned his thick neck, pointing his nose dead north, toward the jagged, shadowy ridges in the distance. Clara let out a long, slow breath. The heat was suffocating. The air shimmered over the prairie like glass. A braided leather riding crop hung from her saddle horn. It stayed exactly where it was. A different kind of rider, a more impatient one, would have grabbed the crop. They would have struck the beast, forced him into submission to stay on schedule. Clara didn't even brush her fingers against the leather. She simply let the reins go slack. She stood there in the blistering heat, sweat beading on her collar, and watched the horse. She acknowledged her own limitations. She had the map, but General had the memory. He was old, and he was tired, but Silas Whitmore had trained him. If the animal's instincts told him the Western Trail was wrong, Clara wasn't going to whip it out of him. She respected the quiet life, breathing beside her too much to force it into compliance. "All right, old man," Clara said softly, her voice barely louder than the dry wind. "North it is. But first, we need to know what's up there." She didn't mount him. She walked beside him, shoulder to shoulder, leading him back toward the town of Mora. The town was a scattered handful of timber and adobe. It clung to the dirt, fighting against the wind. Clara tied General to the hitching post outside the post office. She loosened his cinch a notch so he could breathe easier, then stepped inside. The air in the room was stale but cool. It smelled like dry canvas, old tobacco, and dust. Josiah Miller stood behind the wooden counter. He was 55, with a face weathered like old saddle leather, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He was sorting a stack of yellowed envelopes. He paused when Clara walked in. He watched as she set her heavy leather-bound drafting tube onto the scarred wood of the counter. "You have your father's eyes," Josiah said. No introduction was needed. Everyone in the territory knew Silas Whitmore, and everyone knew the brilliant cartographer was gone. "And his unfinished work," Clara replied. She uncapped the tube. She pulled out the thick, cream-colored parchment and unrolled it flat. "I tried to follow his western survey line this morning. General wouldn't take it. He kept pulling north. The map, it doesn't make sense, Mr. Miller. There are gaps. Whole sections left completely blank." Josiah looked down at the paper. He didn't reach for it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a loaded gun resting on a table. "General knows this land better than any federal paper ever will," Josiah said. His voice was low, gravely. "I need a guide," Clara said. "Someone who actually knows the topography of the northern ridges. Someone who can help me finish what my father started before the government deadline." Josiah stopped sorting the mail. He placed his calloused hands flat on the counter. He leaned in, looking at Clara, really looking at her, measuring her grit. "A map isn't just ink on paper, Miss Whitmore," Josiah stated clearly. His voice carried the heavy, undeniable weight of the frontier. "Drawn wrong, it's a death warrant that strips the right to live and own land from folks who don't have a voice in Washington." Clara held his gaze. She didn't blink. The silence stretched between them, thick and absolute. She absorbed the truth of his words. This wasn't just about geography. It wasn't about her father's legacy either. It was about human lives. "Then who can show me the truth of it?" Clara asked. "Who knows where the real lines belong?" Josiah let out a slow sigh. He looked out the front window, toward the distant northern peaks. "There's only one man alive who knows the true lines of the Cimarron," Josiah said quietly. "Lives up north. Exactly where your horse was looking. Who? Elias Thorne, Josiah said. He shook his head slowly. But I'll warn you right now, the trail to his door isn't an easy one, and the man waiting at the end of it is broken in ways a map can't fix. The post driver was cast iron. It weighed 30 pounds. Elias Thorne lifted it. He brought it down hard. Thud. The cedar post sank another inch into the baked earth. Sweat stung his eyes. He blinked it away. He lifted the iron again. Thud. A sharp, blinding pain flared in his left side. It stole the air right out of his lungs. Elias dropped the heavy driver. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. He leaned his weight against the rough cedar bark. He pressed a gloved hand hard against his ribs. He closed his eyes. He waited for the phantom splintering to pass. 3 years. The bones had knitted together long ago. The ache never truly left. It was a weather vane for storms, and it was a permanent reminder of the prairie road. He caught his breath. He opened his eyes. He looked out over the rolling stretch of scrub and wiregrass. This was the boundary line. On his side lay a modest spread, rough but sturdy. On the other side lay the Blackwood property. The Blackwoods were Cherokee. They had been pushed, prodded, and displaced more times than a man could count. Now they held this small, rocky piece of the Cimarron. Elias picked up the iron driver. He didn't step back to his side of the line. Instead, he carried the driver 10 yards down the Blackwood side. A section of their wire was sagging. The posts were rotting at the base. If a calf leaned against it, the wire would snap. The calf would wander into the ravines. For a family living on the edge of nothing, one lost calf was a disaster. Elias didn't ask for permission. He didn't ask for pay. He grabbed a fresh cedar post from his wagon. He set it deep in the dirt on the Blackwood side. He lifted the iron. He drove it down. He worked in silence. He reinforced their boundary. He protected their livelihood. He did it quietly, so they wouldn't feel the burden of a debt they couldn't afford to pay. He drove the last staple into the wire. As the hammer fell, his mind slipped backward. It happened sometimes when the heat was high and the ribs ached just right. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in the afternoon sun. He was back on the prairie road. It was midnight. The rain had been coming down in sheets. He had been riding back from the surveyor's office. He had trusted the men riding with him. They were supposed to be neighbors. They were supposed to be friends. They were neither. They worked for Jebediah Vance. Vance was a land baron. He didn't want to buy the Cimarron. He wanted to own it by erasing the people already living on it. Elias had seen Vance's forged deeds. He had threatened to speak up, so Vance's men dragged Elias from his saddle. They didn't use guns. Guns made noise. Guns drew the law. They used boot heels. They used pickaxe handles. Elias remembered the taste of mud. He remembered the sickening crack of his own ribs giving way. They kicked him until he stopped moving. They left him in the ditch. They left him to die in the cold rain. They took his horse. They took his maps. They thought they took his voice. Elias! The voice pulled him back to the present. The memory faded. The sun was hot again. Elias turned. A cloud of dust was settling down the trail. Josiah Miller was riding up on a sturdy roan. The postmaster looked out of place this far from town. Josiah pulled back on the reins. He looked at Elias. He looked at the fresh cedar posts on the Blackwood side of the line. Josiah didn't comment on it. He just nodded slowly, acknowledging the silent work. "You're a long way from your stamps, Josiah," Elias said. His voice was rough, like gravel under a boot. Josiah swung down from the saddle. "Got a visitor in town today. Thought you ought to know before she comes knocking. I don't take visitors. You'll want to take this one," Josiah said. He pulled off his hat and wiped his forehead. "Silas Whitmore's daughter. She's got his old horse. And his unfinished map." Elias went still. He stared at the dirt. Silas Whitmore, the man the syndicate hired to draw the official boundaries. The boundaries that would legally steal the land from the Blackwoods and every other small settler. "She's looking for a guide," Josiah continued. "She needs someone who knows the northern ridges. I sent her this way." Elias tightened his grip on his hammer. His jaw clenched. "You shouldn't have done that," Elias said. "She's just a woman trying to finish her father's work, Elias. The government deadline is looming. She's lost." Elias turned fully toward Josiah. His eyes were cold. Hard. "They didn't just break my ribs on that road, Josiah." Elias delivered the brutal truth, his voice slicing through the warm prairie air. They wanted to break the right to exist for everyone beneath them. I won't entertain her, because their laws have never been equal for men like us. Josiah held his ground. She's not them, Elias. She carries their paper, Elias fired back. She draws their lines. It's the same thing. Tell her to turn around. Tell her to go back to Washington. Elias turned his back on the postmaster. He picked up his tools. He tossed them into the back of his wagon. I can't tell her that, Josiah said quietly to Elias's back. She's already on her way. The ride north was brutal. The trail was barely a scar in the earth. It wound upward into the foothills, choked with sage and sharp limestone. Clara Whitmore sat loose in the saddle. She let General set the pace. She was exhausted. Her clothes were stiff with that dust, but she didn't rush the old horse. They crested a low ridge. Below them sat a valley. It was a harsh, beautiful piece of land. A small weathered cabin stood near a creek. A barn sat out back. It was a lonely place. It was a fortress. General pricked his ears forward. He let out a low, rumbling whinny. Clara felt a shift in the animal beneath her. For the first time since they left Mora, General didn't hesitate. He didn't drag his feet. He stepped out with a renewed, purposeful stride. He knew exactly where he was going. They descended into the valley. Clara saw a man standing by a wagon near the barn. He was tall, broad-shouldered. He wore a faded shirt and a battered Stetson. He stood perfectly still, watching them approach. General didn't stop at the hitching post. He didn't stop at the water trough. Clara gently pulled back on the reins to halt him, but the old horse ignored her. He walked right up to the man. General stopped inches from Elias. The horse lowered his massive gray head. He nudged Elias's chest. It was an unmistakable gesture of trust. Clara watched in quiet shock. Her father had trained this horse meticulously. Silas used to say, "A horse doesn't care about a man's title. A horse reads the man's soul." General hadn't chosen the Western Trail on the map. He had chosen the trail that led to this man. He chose the man holding the moral right to the land. Elias didn't smile. He raised a gloved hand and rested it on General's neck. His touch was firm, familiar, but his eyes were fixed on Clara. They were unreadable, defensive. "You're a long way from Washington, Miss Whitmore," Elias said. The greeting was sharp, dismissive. Clara didn't flinch. "And you're exactly where Josiah Miller said you'd be, Mr. Thorne." "Josiah talks too much." Elias patted the horse once, then took a step back. He crossed his arms. "Turn the horse around. You're wasting your time. I don't guide federal surveyors, and I don't help draw lines for syndicates." Clara didn't argue. Not yet. She swung her leg over the saddle. She dropped to the dusty ground. Her boots crunched on the gravel. She didn't walk toward Elias to plead her case. She turned her attention entirely to General. The horse had worked hard. He was sweating. Clara reached up to the bridle. She moved, slowly, deliberately. She unbuckled the leather strap behind his ears. She didn't yank it off. She eased it down. She let the heavy metal bit fall smoothly out of the old horse end mouth. She made sure it didn't catch or pinch his teeth. Elias watched her. His eyes narrowed slightly. Most city folks treated horses like machines. They rode them hard and put them away wet. They ripped the tack off without a second thought. Clara's hands were gentle, respectful. Clara draped the bridle over the fence. She walked to the back of the saddle. A large, heavy wooden crate was strapped there. It held her father's surveying tools, brass transits, plumb bobs, iron chains. It weighed nearly 40 pounds. Elias took a half step forward, a reflex. He was a man accustomed to stepping in for a woman carrying a heavy load. He caught himself. He stopped. He waited. Clara didn't look at him. She didn't bat her eyelashes. She didn't ask for his strength. She unbuckled the leather straps. She braced her boots in the dirt. She hauled the heavy crate off the saddle herself. The weight of it made her stagger a step, but she caught her balance. She carried it to the porch of the cabin and set it down with a heavy thud. She dusted off her hands. She turned back to face Elias. She had earned her right to stand in his yard. "I'm not asking for a favor," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It didn't waver. "I have a job to do. I need a man who knows this territory. I'm told you are that man." "I told you," Elias said, his voice hard. "I don't work for the men in Washington. They draw lines on paper to steal dirt from people who bled for it." "I am not the men in Washington," Clara replied. "I am Silas Whitmore's daughter. My father left this work unfinished. I intend to finish it, honestly, accurately. Accuracy depends on who is holding the pen, Elias countered. Clara reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small leather coin purse. She walked over and set it on the flat top of a fence post between them. I am not asking for charity, Clara stated, her eyes locked on his. I will pay you for your labor, the exact same rate any man would get for this work. My father taught me that mutual respect begins with fair compensation, regardless of who you are or where you come from. Elias stared at the leather purse. Then he looked at Clara. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't acting entitled. She was offering a pure, unvarnished business contract, an equal footing. Elias looked past her. He looked at General. The old horse was grazing peacefully by the fence, untethered. The bit was out of his mouth. The heavy load was off his back. Elias looked back at the woman who had done it. Her hands were blistered. Her skirt was ruined by dust. She hadn't complained once. Her fierce, quiet independence chipped away at the hard shell he had built around himself. He didn't touch the money. Not yet. The Cimarron isn't a park in the capital, Miss Whitmore, Elias said slowly. It is unforgiving. It will break you if you don't respect it. I know how to respect things that are larger than myself, Clara said. She glanced at the horse, then back to Elias. Will you guide me, Mr. Thorne? Elias looked at the fading light over the northern ridges. He looked at the dust on Clara's boots. Sun's going down, Elias said finally. He turned toward the barn. Put the horse in the third stall. There's fresh oats in the barrel. We leave at first light. Night fell over the Cimarron like a heavy blanket. The heat of the day bled up into the starry sky. Elias sat on his front porch. The wood was rough against his back. A rolled cigarette burned between his fingers. He didn't smoke it. He just let it burn. He watched the orange cherry glow in the dark. He was looking at the barn. Inside, the old gray horse was sleeping. The woman was asleep in the loft. Elias listened to the silence. For 3 years, this silence had been his only friend. He had built a fortress out of it. He stayed away from the town. He stayed away from the federal men. He minded his fences. He helped the Blackwoods in the dead of night. He survived. But tonight, the silence felt different. It didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt like a cage. Isolation is not safety. It is just a slow way of dying. A man can only hide for so long before the world forgets he was ever there. He looked at his own hands. They were calloused, strong, but they were empty. He thought about Clara Whitmore. She had unloaded that heavy crate herself. She had taken the bit out of the horse's mouth. She had looked him dead in the eye and offered him a fair wage. She didn't want a savior. She wanted a partner. Elias stood up. He flicked the cigarette into the dirt. He crushed it under his boot heel. The decision was made. He would take her into the Cimarron. Dawn broke cold and gray. The eastern sky bruised purple before the sun finally crested the ridge. Elias was already in the yard. He had the horses saddled. He had a pack mule loaded with water and provisions. Clara walked out of the barn. She wore sturdy boots and a wide-brimmed hat. She carried her father's heavy transit over her shoulder. She didn't look tired. She looked ready. We ride north, Elias said. Keep your horse behind mine. The trail washes out near the canyon edge. Understood, Clara said. They rode out. The Cimarron was a jagged, broken country. It was beautiful, but it was brutal. The earth was slashed with deep ravines. Great slabs of limestone pushed up through the soil like the bones of the earth. The wind whipped through the canyons. It carried the smell of sagebrush and ancient dust. They rode for 3 hours. The sun climbed higher. The heat returned, pressing down on their shoulders. We leave the horses here, Elias said. He pulled up near a stand of scrub oak. The ridge is too steep. We go on foot from here. Clara dismounted. She tied General in the shade. She grabbed her leather satchel and the heavy transit. The climb was treacherous. The ground was nothing but loose shale and sharp rock. Every step was a gamble. Elias took the lead. But he didn't surge ahead. He moved slowly, deliberately. He watched the rocks. But more importantly, he watched Clara. The incline was brutally steep. The loose stones skittered down past their boots, tumbling hundreds of feet into the gorge below. One wrong step meant a broken ankle, or worse. Elias stayed close. He kept himself positioned just slightly below and to the side of her on the switchbacks. He was close enough to catch her if she slipped. His body was tense, ready to brace her weight. But he never touched her. Clara's boot slipped on a slick piece of slate. She stumbled. Her heavy pack pulled her backward. Elias planted his feet. He reached out, his hands hovering an inch from her waist. But he stopped. He let his hands drop back to his sides. "Drop your weight forward," Elias said calmly. "Find the white rock. It's rooted deep." Clara breathed hard. She leaned forward, shifting her center of gravity. Her boot found the solid white limestone. She stabilized herself. She looked back at him. She saw his hands resting at his sides. She saw the space he had deliberately maintained. He didn't grab her. He didn't treat her like she was fragile. He gave her the instruction she needed. But he let her save herself. It was a profound, unspoken respect for her boundaries. Her body was her own. Her balance was her own. "Thank you," she breathed. "Keep your eyes on the stone," he replied. "We're almost there." They reached the summit an hour later. The wind was fierce up here. It tore at their hats and snapped Clara's skirt. They stood on a flat mesa of solid rock. Below them, the Cimarron spread out for miles. It was a sea of green scrub, red rock, and winding dry riverbeds. It was vast. It was overwhelming. Clara immediately unbuckled her satchel. She pulled out the heavy brass transit. She began extending the tripod legs. She pulled out her father's map. "Wait," Elias said. Clara stopped. She looked up. Elias walked to the edge of the mesa. He didn't look at the map. He looked out at the horizon. "Leave the brass in the bag," Elias said. "Come here." Clara hesitated. Her father's training screamed at her to measure, to quantify, to draw the lines. But she left the transit on the rock. She walked over to where Elias stood. "Close your eyes," he said. "Mr. Thorne, I have a deadline. Close them," he repeated. His voice wasn't harsh. It was steady, like the rock beneath their feet. Clara closed her eyes. "Now, tell me what you see," Elias said. "I can't see anything. My eyes are closed." "You're looking with the wrong senses," Elias said. "Listen." The wind hitting the limestone canyon, down to the west. It whistles. A high pitch. That means the rock is hollowed out. Water runs deep underground there. It's a natural aquifer. Now listen to the east. Clara turned her head. The wind sounded different. It was a low, rushing sound. "That's the scrub oak in the draw," Elias explained. "The soil is thick there. Rich. It holds the rain. That's where the deer bed down. That's where the Blackwood family grazes their cattle." Clara opened her eyes. She looked at the man standing beside her. The wind tore at his hair. His eyes were focused on the horizon, not on paper. "Why do you read the terrain by sound?" Clara asked. "My father mapped the world with geometry, with sight." Elias turned to look at her. The shadows of his past darkened his eyes. "The men in Washington draw lines with their eyes and their greed," Elias said. His voice cut through the howling wind. It carried the heavy weight of truth. "They look at a map and they see property. They see timber. They see minerals. They draw a straight line through a valley and call it a border. But the land doesn't care about ink." He pointed down to the deep draw in the east. "If you draw a line straight through that draw, you cut a man off from his water. You give the high ground to a syndicate, and you leave a farmer to starve in the dust. The land has its own heartbeat, Clara. It tells you where the boundaries naturally lie. It tells you who needs the water and who needs the stone." Elias stepped closer to the tripod. He placed his calloused hand on the brass transit. "If you don't learn to respect and listen to the earth," Elias said, "you have no right to divide it." Clara stood frozen. She looked down at her father's map. The blank spaces suddenly didn't look like missing information. They looked like scars. They looked like a question she didn't know how to answer. She walked back to the transit. She folded the legs. She placed it gently back into the leather bag. "Teach me," Clara said. She didn't unroll the paper again that day. They sat on the edge of the world. They listened to the wind. They listened to the earth. And for the first time in 3 years, Elias Thorne felt like he wasn't entirely alone. The campfire cracked and popped. The smoke drifted up, dissolving into the black canopy of the night. Clara sat on a smooth river stone. Her muscles ached. Her boots were scuffed gray with limestone dust. The physical toll of the Cimarron was immense. But her mind was racing. Elias was on the other side of the fire. He was quietly oiling a piece of saddle leather. He hadn't spoken in an hour. He didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was a working silence, A comfortable one. Clara pulled her heavy wooden crate closer to the firelight. She popped the brass latches. The lid groaned open. Inside sat her father Hess' legacy. Stacks of field notes, bound leather journals, vials of dried ink, steel-nibbed pens. Silas Whitmore had been a meticulous man. He recorded everything. Every coordinate, every elevation, every change in the weather. He believed that facts were the ultimate truth. But today, Elias had shown her a different truth. A truth that couldn't be measured with a plumb bob. Clara pulled out the main ledger. It was a thick, heavy book. The cover was worn smooth from her father's hands. She opened it. The pages were filled with his precise, elegant handwriting, columns of numbers, sketches of ridgelines. She flipped to the back of the book. She was looking for the coordinates of the northern boundary, the section that was blank on the map. The pages were empty. Clara frowned. She ran her fingers over the thick paper. She turned another page, still empty, but the binding felt strange. It was stiff, bulky. She held the book closer to the fire. She ran her thumb along the inner spine. There was a slit in the leather. It was cut perfectly, deliberately. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She set her cup of coffee down in the dirt. She carefully wedged her fingernail into the slit. She pulled. A piece of paper slipped out. It was folded twice. It was yellowed at the edges. Elias didn't look up from his leather work, but the rhythmic sound of his rubbing paused for a fraction of a second. He noticed the shift in her breathing. He stayed silent. Clara unfolded the paper. It was her father's handwriting. But it wasn't a list of numbers. It wasn't a survey log. It was a letter. The ink was heavily pressed into the page, as if he had written it in a state of deep agitation. The firelight danced across the words. Clara read them. October 14th, 1875. They think I am a fool. The syndicate men. Jebediah Vance and his lawyers in Washington. They hired me to map the Cimarron because my name carries weight. Because my stamp makes a theft look like a legal transaction. I have walked this land. I have seen the stakes they drove into the ground. They are drawing straight lines through the Cherokee settlements. They are cutting the independent ranchers off from the river. They are trying to legalize a massacre of livelihoods. Clara stopped breathing. Her eyes darted over the words. Her father knew. He knew about the corruption. He knew about the stolen land. She kept reading. I met a man today, Elias Thorne. He understands the dirt better than I understand my own math. He and the Blackwood family have a moral right to this valley. They bled for it. They survived it. Vance's men intend to take it all. I am expected to submit the final map tomorrow. If I draw the lines they demand, the federal army will enforce them. The people here will be driven out, or they will be killed. Clara's hands began to shake. The paper trembled. I will not do it. To draw a border through a man's home without his consent is the act of a tyrant, not a scientist. I would rather leave this map unfinished and be called a failure than complete it by trampling on the human rights of Elias Thorne and the Blackwood family. I leave the Northern Territory blank. Let the courts fight over the void. I strip the syndicate of my legal endorsement. I only pray that one day, the men who truly own this land will find the strength to draw the lines themselves. Clara stared at the bottom of the page. The signature was bold, defiant. Silas Whitmore. The world tilted on its axis. Everything Clara believed about her father was suddenly shattered and rebuilt in a single breath. She had spent the last 3 years thinking he had lost his touch. The scientific community whispered that old Silas Whitmore had gone senile at the end, that he couldn't finish a simple survey. It had stained his reputation. It had humiliated him in the halls of the academy, and he had let them say it. He had swallowed his pride. He had accepted the ruin of his professional name. He did it to protect a Cherokee family he barely knew. He did it to protect a cowboy who lived alone in the dirt. He didn't fail. He rebelled. He deliberately broke the map to sabotage a corporate empire. It was an act of profound civil disobedience. Clara sat frozen. A lesser woman would have screamed. A different daughter would have raged at the sky. She would have crumpled the paper and thrown it into the fire, furious that her father had lied to her. Furious that he had sent her out here to clean up a mess he intentionally made. Clara did none of those things. She looked across the fire at Elias. He was sitting quietly. He had survived the brutal beating on the Prairie road, 3 years ago, the very same year this letter was written. He had bled for this land, just as her father had written. Her father had protected him, in the only way a man with a pen knew how. Clara looked down at the letter, her vision blurred. A single tear escaped, cutting a clean track through the limestone dust on her cheek. It fell, landing with a soft tap on the dry earth. She didn't make a sound. She didn't seek comfort. She placed the letter on her lap. Her blistered hands moved slowly. She gently pressed her palms against the paper. She smoothed out the creases. She ironed out the wrinkles of the old, yellowed page with absolute reverence. She accepted the truth. She didn't judge her father for his secrecy. She understood the massive, crushing weight of his humanity. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant looking like a failure to the rest of the world. She carefully folded the letter. She slipped it into the breast pocket of her shirt, right over her heart. She picked up her coffee cup. The tin was cold now. She took a slow sip. Elias finally looked up. He saw the tear tracks on her dusty face. He saw the shift in her posture. The rigid, desperate need to conquer the map was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, immovable strength. "You found something," Elias said softly. It wasn't a question. Clara looked at him through the smoke of the fire. "I found out why my father's map was blank," Clara said. Her voice was steady, grounded. "He didn't forget the lines, Elias. He refused to draw them. He refused to participate in the theft." Elias stopped moving. The piece of leather slipped from his hand. He stared at her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his scarred jaw. "He left it blank for you," Clara said. She didn't pity him. She didn't offer apologies for the men who had hurt him. She just offered him the unvarnished truth. He believed that drawing a border without consent is tyranny. He left it blank because he believed you were the only one who had the right to finish it. Elias looked at the flames. The crackle of the burning wood sounded like breaking bone. He swallowed hard. The ghosts of the Prairie Road drifted into the camp. But this time they didn't bring terror. They brought a strange, heavy peace. Clara closed the heavy wooden crate. She snapped the brass latches shut. The click echoed in the quiet canyon. "The map is yours, Elias," Clara said quietly. "It always was. What do you want to do with it?" Elias didn't answer right away. He looked out into the darkness of the Cimarron. He listened to the wind. He listened to the land. And for the first time in his life, he began to think about tomorrow. The morning was bright. The sky was a hard, pale blue, wiped clean by the night winds. Elias Thorne sat on the edge of the limestone ridge. He held a tin cup of coffee. The coffee was bitter. He liked it that way. It kept him sharp. He watched Clara Whitmore. She was 50 yards down the slope. She was on her knees in the red dirt. She had her father's heavy surveyor's chain in her hands. She was dragging the iron links through a dry creek bed. The iron clinked against the stones. It was a rhythmic, steady sound. She was working. But she was working differently today. Yesterday, she had been fighting the land. She had been trying to make the dirt match the paper. Today the paper was put away. Her father's unfinished map was locked securely in its wooden crate. She wasn't trying to conquer the Cimarron anymore. She was listening to it. Elias watched her pull the heavy chain. The sun beat down on her back. Dust coated her dress. She stopped every few yards. She took out a small blank notebook. She wrote down the natural dips of the earth. She noted where the water would flow when the spring rains came. She marked the stands of scrub oak where the soil was deep. She was doing the exact thing her father had refused to do. She was mapping the truth. Elias took a slow sip of his coffee. He felt a strange tightening in his chest. It wasn't the old ache in his ribs. It was something else. It was respect. He had spent 3 years believing that everyone who came from the East was a thief. He believed they were all tools of Jebediah, Vance, and the syndicates. He believed they only saw the world in dollar signs and straight lines. Clara was different. She had read her father's letter. She had learned that her own legacy was built on a deliberate failure. Most people would have quit. They would have packed up their brass transits and gone back to Washington. They would have hid from the shame. Clara stayed. She stayed in the dirt. She smoothed out the wrinkles of her father's rebellion and made it her own. She dropped the heavy iron chain. She wiped her brow with the back of her gloved hand. She looked up the slope at him. She didn't wave. She didn't ask for a break. She just picked up the chain and kept moving west. Elias set his tin cup on the rock. Action speaks louder than Washington ink, he thought. She carries her own weight. She respects the blank spaces. He stood up. He walked down the steep incline. He moved easily over the loose shale. He didn't offer to take the chain from her hands. To do so would insult the work she was putting in. Instead, he walked to the far end of the creek bed. He picked up the heavy brass anchor stake. He drove it into the earth for her, securing the line so she could pull it taut. They worked together for 3 hours. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The work was the conversation. By noon, the heat was unbearable. The air shimmered like glass over the rocks. "We're done for the day," Elias called out. His voice echoed off the canyon walls. "The sun will blind you on the brass now. We head back to the cabin." Clara didn't argue. She nodded. She began coiling the heavy chain. She was exhausted. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed the gear, but her eyes were clear, focused. They rode back in silence. The cabin was cool when they arrived. The thick adobe walls kept the brutal afternoon heat at bay. Clara carried her heavy wooden crate inside. She set it on the large, sturdy kitchen table. She popped the brass latches. She pulled out a fresh, completely blank sheet of heavy drafting parchment. She pinned the corners down. She set her ink vials in a neat row. She laid out her steel-nibbed pens. She stood over the blank paper. She looked at it for a long time. Elias stood in the doorway. He leaned his shoulder against the timber frame. He watched her. "It's a big country to draw from scratch," Elias said quietly. Clara let out a slow breath. "It is, but it's the only way. I have to recreate the northern boundary. I have to map the water lines and the Cherokee grazing lands. I have 11 days before Surveyor Boone arrives from the federal office. If I don't have a finished, accurate map to hand him, the government defaults to the old survey." She looked down at her hands. "The old survey is Vance's survey. It gives the syndicate everything." "You can't map the entire northern ridge in 11 days, Elias stated. It was a simple fact. The terrain was too rough. The miles were too vast. Not even your father could do it that fast. "I have to try," Clara said fiercely. She picked up a pencil. "I won't let Vance win. I won't let my father's silence be for nothing." Elias looked at her. He saw the fierce, burning determination in her eyes. It was a fire he recognized. It was the same fire he had felt burning in his own chest 3 years ago. He closed his eyes. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in a cool adobe cabin. He was crawling through the mud. It was the night on the Prairie road. The rain was freezing. His left side was a canvas of agony. 3 ribs shattered, puncturing the muscle. Every breath tasted like copper and wet dirt. Vance's men had left him in the ditch. They had laughed as they rode away. They assumed the cold would finish the job the pickaxe handles started. Elias remembered dragging his broken body through the sagebrush. He didn't walk. He crawled, like a wounded animal. It took him 14 hours to cross 3 miles of prairie. He remembered pulling himself up the steps of this very cabin. He remembered falling through the door. But most importantly, he remembered what he did next. He didn't just wrap his ribs. He didn't just drink whiskey to dull the pain. He dragged himself to his heavy oak desk. He lit a lantern. His hands were covered in dried blood and black mud. His breathing was shallow, ragged gasps. He had pulled out a sheet of parchment. He knew Vance was going to steal the land. He knew the syndicates were going to forge the borders. He knew they thought he was dead. So Elias drew. He drew the Cimarron. Not with geometry, not with federal coordinates. He drew it from memory. He drew it from his soul. He mapped every hidden spring. He charted every deep draw where the soil was rich. He drew the exact undeniable boundaries of the Blackwood family's ancestral claim. He marked the high ridges and the low valleys. He spent 3 days at that desk. He bled on the paper. He sweat on the parchment. He didn't sleep until the map was perfect. He had forged a weapon out of his own brokenness, and then he had locked it away in a drawer. Waiting. He didn't know what he was waiting for until today. Elias opened his eyes. The memory faded. He was back in the cool cabin. Clara was still standing over her blank parchment. She was struggling to remember the curve of the dry creek bed they had measured that morning. Elias pushed off the doorframe. He walked across the room. He didn't go to the kitchen. He walked to the heavy oak desk in the far corner of the cabin. It was covered in dust and old saddle catalogs. Clara paused. She watched him. She saw the sudden heavy purpose in his stride. Elias knelt. He reached underneath the desk. His fingers found a hidden catch. He pressed it. A small hidden drawer slid open with a soft wooden scrape. He reached inside. He pulled out a heavy leather-bound roll. It was tied with a thick rawhide string. He stood up. He walked over to the kitchen table. Clara stepped back. She didn't know what it was, but she felt the gravity of the object in his hands. It felt heavy with secrets. Elias stopped on the other side of the table. He looked at Clara. His eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. They were the eyes of a man who had survived a war no one else knew about. "You said you have 11 days to draw a new map," Elias said. His voice was low. It rumbled in his chest. "You said you can't let Vance win." "Yes," Clara whispered. Elias untied the rawhide string. He placed the leather roll on the table, right on top of her blank parchment. With one swift motion, he unrolled it. Clara gasped. She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. She couldn't believe what she was looking at. It was a map, but it was unlike any map she had ever seen. It was breathtaking in its detail. It wasn't drawn with rigid, soulless lines. It was drawn with deep, heavy strokes of ink. It showed the true topography of the northern ridges. Every canyon was shaded perfectly. Every underground aquifer was noted with tiny, precise script. But it was the borders that caught her breath. They weren't straight. They followed the natural contours of the earth. They wrapped around the river bends. They protected the timberlines. And right in the center, boldly outlined in thick black ink, was the Blackwood property. It was completely insulated, completely protected by natural boundaries that no federal court could legally argue against. It was a masterpiece of cartography. It was better than anything her father had ever drawn. It was alive. Clara reached out. Her fingers hovered over the parchment. She noticed something else. There were faint, rusted brown stains near the bottom corners, dried blood. She looked up at Elias. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Elias," Clara breathed, her voice trembling with awe. "Where did you get this? Who drew this?" Elias didn't look away. He stood tall. The ghosts of the Prairie Road were finally laid to rest. "I did," Elias said. Clara stared at him. "When?" 3 years ago," Elias answered. The words were heavy, final. "The night Jebediah Vance's men dragged me off my horse. The night they shattered my ribs and left me in the mud to die." Clara covered her mouth with her hand. She looked down at the bloodstains on the paper. "I crawled back to this cabin," Elias continued. His voice didn't waver. It was steady. It was the voice of a survivor. "I couldn't breathe. I couldn't stand, but I could hold a pen." He stepped closer to the table. He tapped a calloused finger against the heavy black line, outlining the Cherokee lands. "I charted this while I was bleeding," Elias declared. His words filled the room, echoing with undeniable authority. "Because if the broken don't stand up and draw their own lines, the whole and powerful will take everything. Rights are never handed out, Clara. They have to be claimed." Clara stood frozen. The sheer magnitude of his statement washed over her. It was a direct lesson on self-reliance. It was a brutal, honest truth about the world. The law didn't protect the weak. The law protected the men who wrote the law. If you wanted justice, you couldn't wait for a man in Washington to hand it to you. You had to carve it out of the dirt yourself. You had to bleed for it. Her father had left the map blank as an act of silent protection. He had stepped out of the way. But Elias had filled the blank space. The broken cowboy had forged the very weapon that could change everything. "You did this," Clara whispered, her eyes tracing the flawless shading of the canyons. "You drew the perfect survey. You mapped the human rights of this entire territory. Why did you hide it? Why didn't you submit it to the surveyor's office?" Elias looked down at his own hands. "Because I was just a cowboy, a lone rancher with broken ribs. If I walked into the federal office with this, Vance's men would have burned it. They would have killed me in broad daylight, and the government would have looked the other way. I had the truth, but I didn't have the authority to make them accept it." He looked back up at Clara. "But you do," Elias said softly. Clara straightened up. "You carry Silas Whitmore's name," Elias said. "You carry his federal commission. You have the legal right to submit a final draft to Surveyor Boone. If my map is attached to your father's official seal, they can't throw it out. It becomes federal record. It becomes law." Clara looked from Elias to the map and back again. The pieces fell into place. Her father's silence. General's stubborn refusal to walk the Western Trail, the blank spaces in the ledger. It had all led her to this cabin. It had all led her to this man. Elias hadn't just survived the Prairie Road. He had prepared for a war. He had just been waiting for the right ally to help him fight it. "We merge them," Clara said. Her voice was no longer trembling. It was forged in steel. She reached into her crate. She pulled out her father's unfinished map. She laid it down on the table, right next to Elias's blood-stained parchment. "My father mapped the southern grids," Clara said, her finger tracing the lines. "He established the legal framework. You mapped the northern truth. If we merge your topography into his federal template, it creates an impenetrable legal document. It will lock Vance out of the Cimarron forever." Elias watched her. He saw the fire in her. She wasn't an Eastern aristocrat playing in the dirt. She was a weapon, just like the map. "It's going to be meticulous work," Clara said. She unstoppered a vial of black ink. She picked up a steel pen. "The scales have to match perfectly. The coordinates have to align. It will take every hour we have left before Boone arrives." Elias pulled up a heavy wooden chair. He sat down next to her at the table. "Then we better get started," Elias said. He didn't pull away. He didn't retreat to his isolation. He leaned over the table, his shoulder brushing against hers. He pointed to a jagged ridgeline on his map. "Start here," Elias instructed. "The elevation drops 300 feet. At this marker, write that down." Clara dipped her pen in the ink. She touched the nib to the fresh parchment. She didn't write her father's numbers. She wrote Elias's truth. The broken cowboy hadn't just saved himself. He had handed her the power to save an entire territory. And as the ink flowed onto the page, Clara knew one thing for certain. The men who broke Elias Thorne on the Prairie Road had made a fatal mistake. They had left him alive. The oil lamp burned low. It cast a golden, flickering circle on the heavy oak desk. The rest of the cabin was swallowed by shadows. It was 3 a.m. The wind howled outside, rattling the thick glass of the window panes. Clara Whitmore rubbed her eyes. Her fingers were stained with black India ink. Her back ached. Her shoulders were locked tight from hours of hovering over the parchment. She took a slow, deep breath. She smelled kerosene, old leather, and the sharp, metallic tang of the ink. She looked down at the table. 2 maps lay before her. On the left was her father's official federal survey. It was precise, rigid. The southern grids were perfectly marked. The northern section was a gaping white void. On the right was Elias's map. The leather-bound parchment, the map drawn in blood and defiance. It was a masterpiece of natural topography. Clara picked up a large sheet of translucent tracing paper. She had been copying Elias's topographical lines for 6 hours. She needed to see how they fit into the federal grid. She needed to know where the seams met. She carefully lifted the tracing paper. She hovered it over her father's federal map. She aligned the southern border. She matched the longitude lines. She adjusted the paper a fraction of an inch to the left. She set it down. She leaned in close. The lamplight caught the ink. Clara stopped breathing. She didn't just look at the map, she stared at it. Her mind raced, calculating the geometry, calculating the scales. It was impossible. Elias had drawn his map by hand. He had used a local pacing scale. He had drawn it from memory, while nursing shattered ribs, isolated in this cabin. Her father had drawn his map using a transit, using federal coordinates, using the stars and a brass plumb bob. They shouldn't fit together perfectly. The edges should have been messy. There should have been overlapping errors. There should have been acres of disputed, unaccounted land between where Silas stopped and Elias began. But there wasn't. The jagged, natural border of Elias's map snapped into her father's federal grid like a key sliding into a meticulously crafted lock. It was flawless. Silas hadn't just stopped drawing. He hadn't just abandoned the work in the middle of a valley. He had surveyed the exact perimeter of the disputed territory. He had measured every inch of the outside border. And then he had deliberately built a protective federal fence around the blank space. Clara sat back in her chair. The wood creaked loudly in the silent room. Twist. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her father didn't leave the map blank just to protect Elias from Jebediah Vance. He left it blank to teach her a lesson. Silas Whitmore was the greatest cartographer of his generation. His entire life was dedicated to the belief that empty spaces were meant to be measured, conquered, defined by his pen. He was an arrogant man in his science, but right here, on this parchment, he had laid his arrogance down. He had created the perfect frame, but he refused to paint the picture inside it. He knew the acreage. He knew the coordinates. He could have drawn the Cherokee borders himself. He could have played the savior. He could have submitted a map that protected everyone and kept his own reputation intact. He chose not to. Clara traced the invisible seam where the two maps met, her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, of profound, overwhelming respect. Her father had realized that some things are not meant to be conquered by outsiders. He realized that stepping in and drawing the lines for a marginalized people was just another form of tyranny, even if it was done with good intentions. Restraint, silence, these were not failures. They were the ultimate forms of protection. Silas had left the space blank so the man who bled for the dirt could claim it himself. The cabin door opened. The wind rushed in, bringing the cold scent of the coming dawn. Elias stepped inside. He carried an armful of chopped cedar. He kicked the door shut behind him. He looked tired. The deep lines around his eyes were carved by years of hard living and restless nights. He walked to the cast iron stove. He dumped the wood into the metal bin with a heavy clatter. "You should be sleeping," Elias said. His voice was rough. "Come here," Clara said. Elias turned. He saw the look on her face. He wiped the sawdust from his leather gloves. He walked over to the desk. He stood beside her, looking down at the illuminated parchment. "Look at the borders," Clara said quietly. She tapped her ink-stained finger on the tracing paper. Elias leaned in. His eyes scanned the lines. He saw the jagged edge of his own topography perfectly cradled by the rigid, straight lines of Silas's federal grid. "I don't understand," Elias muttered. "I didn't use federal coordinates. How does it match?" "It matches because he made it match," Clara said. She looked up at him. She didn't hide the emotion in her voice. She let him hear the truth. "My father knew exactly what was in that valley, Elias. He surveyed the entire perimeter. He measured the exact acreage of the Blackwood property. He knew the aquifer was there. He knew everything." Elias frowned. "Then why didn't he draw it?" "Because he knew you were already drawing it," Clara said. Elias went perfectly still. The air in the cabin seemed to thin out. "Look at the lock he built," Clara said, pointing to the perfect seam. "He drew the federal boundary up to the exact inch of your land, and then he stopped. He built a legal wall to keep Vance out, but he left the inside blank. He left the interior for you." Elias stared at the paper. His chest rose and fell in a slow, ragged rhythm. "He could have drawn it himself," Elias whispered. The words sounded choked. "He could have finished it. He would have kept his commission. He wouldn't have died a laughingstock in Washington." "He didn't want to be a savior," Clara answered. "He wanted you to have your own voice." Elias backed away from the table. For 3 years, he had hated Silas Whitmore. He had cursed the man's name. He had believed Silas was just another corrupt Easterner who abandoned the Cimarron to the wolves. He had believed his own suffering on the Prairie Road was ignored by the men with the pens. Now, he was looking at the undeniable proof. Silas Whitmore had thrown himself on his own sword. He had embraced professional ruin. He had let the world call him a failure, just to give a broken cowboy the chance to fight his own war. Elias's jaw clenched. The muscles in his neck stood out like cords of iron. The weight of Silas's sacrifice crashed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He didn't say a word. He turned on his heel. He walked to the cabin door. He threw it open and walked out into the cold gray dawn. The sun was just beginning to crest the eastern ridge. It painted the limestone cliffs in shades of bruised purple and dull gold. Elias walked. He didn't saddle a horse. He just walked down the sloping rocky trail behind the barn. He headed toward the creek. The water was rushing fast, swollen with the spring melt. It crashed over the smooth river stones. It was loud. It drowned out the wind. It drowned out the thoughts in his head. Elias stopped at the edge of the water. He took off his Stetson. He dropped it in the dirt. He stood there, staring at the rushing water. Back in the cabin, Clara stood by the window. She watched him go. Every instinct in her body told her to follow him. Society taught women to be fixers, to be nurturers. When a man was hurting, a woman was supposed to rush to his side. She was supposed to soft words. She was supposed to touch his shoulder and tell him everything was going to be all right. Clara didn't move from the window. She gripped the wooden sill. She held herself back. She understood something fundamental about human grief. She understood that Elias's pain was not hers to manage. It was his. He had carried a massive, heavy hatred for 3 years. Now that hatred was gone, replaced by a devastating sense of gratitude and loss. To run down there and offer platitudes would be incredibly selfish. It would be an attempt to make herself feel better. It would force him to mask his emotions to comfort her. Clara let go of the windowsill. She stepped back into the kitchen. She walked over to the cast iron stove. She stoked the embers. She added a few pieces of the cedar Elias had just chopped. She took the metal grinder and filled it with dark coffee beans. She turned the crank. The grinding noise was loud and rhythmic. She boiled the water. She brewed the coffee strong and black, just the way he drank it. She poured it into a dented tin cup. Clara walked out the front door. The morning air bit at her face. She walked down the rocky trail toward the creek. Elias didn't hear her coming. The water was too loud. He was standing with his hands on his hips, his head bowed. His shoulders were shaking slightly. A man breaking apart and pulling himself back together all at once. Clara didn't call out his name. She didn't announce her presence. She walked to a large flat river stone about 10 yards away from him. She placed the steaming tin cup on the rock. She didn't linger. She didn't wait for him to turn around. She didn't demand an interaction. She gave him the absolute, unspoken respect of privacy. She turned around and walked quietly back up the hill to the cabin. Implicit healing. She gave him the space to process his grief without trying to fix him. She showed him that he was safe to fall apart, and that he wouldn't be judged for it. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher. The frost melted off the sagebrush. The cabin door opened. Elias walked in. He carried his Stetson in one hand. In the other, he carried the empty tin cup. He walked to the stove. He set the cup down gently on the cast iron. He walked over to the heavy oak desk. Clara was sitting there. She was holding a steel-nibbed pen, waiting. Elias looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed. The hard, defensive armor he had worn for 3 years was completely gone. He looked exhausted, but he looked lighter. The phantom pain in his shattered ribs felt distant for the first time. He ruined his name, Elias said. His voice was a rasp, barely a whisper. He let them call him a senile old fool in the papers. He did it for a man he barely knew. I don't know how to repay a debt like that. Clara put her pen down. She folded her hands on the table. She looked him directly in the eyes. You don't repay it, Clara said firmly. You honor it. Elias held her gaze. My father's silence wasn't an abandonment, Clara told him, delivering the absolute truth of the morning. Sometimes, the only way to truly respect a man who has been stripped of his power is to hand the choice entirely back to him, even if it costs you your own reputation. The words hung in the air, explicit dialogue, a clear, ringing lesson on justice. True advocacy wasn't about rushing in on a white horse and saving the day. It wasn't about a politician drawing a line and demanding applause. True advocacy was stepping aside. It was taking the hit so the marginalized could stand up and speak for themselves. Silas had handed the choice back to Elias. Now it was up to Elias to make it. Elias looked down at the map. He looked at the flawless seam where his drawing met Silas' grid. He reached across the table. He picked up a vial of black ink. He uncorked it. He slid it across the wood, stopping it right next to Clara's hand. 10 days left, Elias said. The gravel was back in his voice, but the bitterness was gone. It was replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. Vance's surveyor is coming. We have a lot of lines to trace before he gets here. Clara smiled. It was a small, fierce smile. Yes, we do, she said. She picked up her steel-nibbed pen. She dipped it into the black ink. She didn't write on the tracing paper anymore. She moved her hand over to the official federal parchment. She found the exact coordinate where her father's line ended. She placed the nib of her pen against the paper. Elias leaned over the table. He pointed to the next coordinate on his leather map. 3 degrees north, Elias said. Follow the bend of the river. Clara drew the line. It was bold. It was permanent. They weren't just making a map anymore. They were writing a legal precedent. They were taking the broken pieces of a cowboy and the shattered reputation of a cartographer, and they were forging a shield. The cabin was quiet again. The only sound was the scratching of the steel pen against the heavy paper. The sound of a new history being written, one drop of ink at a time. The rain started on the 5th day. It didn't come down hard. It was a slow, steady drizzle. It turned the red dirt of the yard into thick, heavy mud. It drummed against the wooden shingles of the cabin roof. It was a relentless, rhythmic sound. Inside the cabin, the air was thick. The cast-iron stove burned hot to keep the dampness out. Elias Thorne sat at the heavy oak desk. He was exhausted. His shoulders were knotted tight. His eyes burned from staring at the parchment. They had been working for 5 days straight. Sleep was a luxury they took in 3-hour shifts. The deadline was a noose, and it was pulling tighter every hour. Clara was across the room. She was kneeling on the floor beside her father's wooden crate. She was looking for a fresh steel nib for her pen. The intricate work of tracing the Southern Creek lines had worn her last one down to a blunt edge. She pulled out the leather-bound journals. She pulled out the brass plumb bobs. She stacked them neatly on the floorboards. She reached the absolute bottom of the crate. It was lined with a piece of heavy green felt. She pressed her hand against the felt to check for loose nibs. The felt shifted. It wasn't glued down. It was a false bottom. Clara lifted the green cloth. Elias didn't look up. He was carefully shading the elevation lines of the northern ridge. He dipped his pen in the black ink. He held his breath to keep his hand steady. "Elias," Clara said. Her voice was different. It wasn't the sharp, focused tone she used when asking for a coordinate. It was soft, hesitant. Elias finished his stroke. He set the pen down. He turned in his chair. Clara was standing up. She was holding a heavy, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with red wax. The wax was stamped with the official seal of the Federal Surveyor's office. But it wasn't a government document. It was a personal letter. "I found this under the felt," Clara said. She walked slowly toward the desk. She didn't open it. She held it out to him. Elias looked at the envelope. The handwriting was elegant, precise. Silas Whitmore's handwriting. Right in the center, written in bold black ink, was his own name, Elias Thorne. Elias stared at it. He felt a sudden cold knot pull tight in his gut. Silas had left the map blank. He had hidden a journal page explaining why. What else could he possibly have left behind? Elias wiped his ink-stained fingers on a rag. He reached out and took the envelope. The paper was thick, heavy. It felt like holding a loaded gun. "It's sealed," Elias noted. "He never sent it," Clara said quietly. "He hid it, along with the map." Clara took a step back. She didn't hover. She didn't ask him to read it out loud. She gave him the room to face whatever ghost was hiding inside that envelope. She turned around and walked to the stove, pretending to check the coffee. Elias looked down at the red wax. He slid his thumb under the flap. He broke the seal. The wax snapped with a sharp crack. He pulled out a single sheet of folded paper. He opened it. The handwriting was rushed. It lacked the careful geometry of Silas's map work. The ink was splattered in places. It was the handwriting of a man who was terrified, a man who was running out of time. Elias read the date. October 16th, 1875, 2 days after the journal entry Clara had found, 2 days after Silas had decided to leave the map blank, and exactly 1 week after the night on the Prairie Road. Elias began to read. "Elias, if you are reading this, I am likely dead. Or I have returned to Washington a ruined man. Either way, my time in the Cimarron is over. I could not leave without telling you the truth. I know what happened to you on the Prairie Road." Elias stopped breathing. The words jumped off the page. The rain hammering on the roof suddenly sounded like 100 pickaxe handles hitting the mud. The phantom pain in his left side flared up, sharp and blinding. "I was in the surveyor's office the night before they attacked you. I heard them talking. I heard the orders given. It was Jebediah Vance. He gave the order himself." Elias's hands began to shake. The paper trembled. Vance. For 3 years, Elias had known the men who beat him, worked for the syndicate, but the syndicate was a faceless monster. It was a corporation in Washington. It was a shadow. He didn't know exactly who had given the word to leave him in the dirt. Now he had a name, he had the head of the snake. He kept reading. His eyes devoured the ink. Vance knew you had the old Spanish land grants. He knew you were advising the Blackwood family. He told his men you were a problem. He told them to remove you, permanently. He paid them $300 out of the Syndicate S lockbox to break your bones and bury you in the scrub. Elias's jaw clenched, his teeth ground together. The muscles in his forearms pulled tight as wire. $300. That was the price of his life. That was what his ribs were worth to Jebediah Vance. You are likely wondering why I did not take this to the territorial marshal. Why I did not have Vance arrested. I tried. I stood outside the Marshal S office in Mora. But I saw Vance inside, drinking whiskey with the judge. I saw the marshal pocketing syndicate coin. I leave this truth in your hands, Elias. The words burned into Elias's mind. Silas wasn't just giving him information. He was giving him a mandate. Equality under the law is a farce if the men drawing the maps are corrupt. I did not submit this to the authorities, because their laws do not yet protect men like you. Explicit dialogue. A damning, undeniable indictment of a broken system. Silas had realized the bitter truth of the frontier. The law was a tool, and in the Cimarron, the syndicates owned the handle. You couldn't ask a corrupt system to police its own corruption. You couldn't beg for justice from the men who bought the judge. True justice must be decided by those who bled for this dirt. Elias finished the letter. The signature at the bottom was hasty. Silas. Elias lowered the paper. He stared blankly at the rough timber wall of the cabin, but he didn't see the wood. He saw Jebediah Vance. He saw the man sitting in a leather chair in Mora, drinking expensive whiskey, laughing. He saw the men with the pickaxe handles. A dark, terrifying rage rose up in Elias' chest. It was a pure, unadulterated hatred. It tasted like ash in the back of his throat. He had the proof. He had a written confession from a federal official detailing an attempted murder ordered by Jebediah Vance. He could end it right now. He could walk out to the barn. He could saddle General. He could ride into Mora. He could walk through the doors of the saloon, find Vance, and put a bullet right between the man's eyes. It wouldn't be murder. It would be an execution. It would be the true justice Silas had written about. Elias' hands gripped the letter. Implicit action. His knuckles turned stark white. The paper began to crumple under the crushing force of his grip. He was a breath away from tearing it to shreds, grabbing his rifle, and walking out the door. The trauma of the Prairie Road demanded blood. It demanded a reckoning. He stood up. The heavy oak chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Clara turned around. She saw him. She saw the violent tension vibrating in his chest. She saw the white-hot murder in his eyes. He looked like a wild animal that had finally been let off the chain. She didn't speak. She didn't tell him to calm down. She didn't rush over and grab his arm. She just stood by the stove, holding the coffee pot, and watched him. She witnessed his war. Elias looked at her. He looked past her. He looked at the heavy oak desk. He saw the map. It was laid out flat. The borders were half-drawn. His natural topography was merging flawlessly with Silas' federal grid. The Blackwood property was heavily outlined in fresh black ink. It was an impenetrable fortress of legal rights. It was beautiful. It was the future. Elias looked back at the crumpled letter in his fist. If he rode into town and killed Vance, Vance would die, but Elias would hang. The territorial judge would see to it, and if Elias hung, the map died with him. If he became a murderer, the federal surveyor arriving in 5 days would never accept his topography. They would throw the map in the fire. They would default to the syndicate's lines. The Blackwoods would lose their land. The small ranchers would be starved out. Vance would win from the grave. He would have succeeded in breaking Elias, turning him into exactly the kind of lawless savage the syndicates claimed the frontier was full of. Elias closed his eyes. He listened to the rain hitting the roof. He listened to the steady, quiet breathing of the woman standing by the stove. He thought about the old horse in the barn. He thought about the cedar fence posts he had driven for the Blackwoods. True justice must be decided by those who bled for this dirt. Silas was right, but Elias suddenly understood that justice didn't always look like a bullet. Sometimes, true justice was surviving. Sometimes, justice was outliving the men who tried to kill you, and building a world where they had no power left. Vengeance would fix the past, but it would destroy tomorrow. Elias opened his eyes. The murderous fire had burned itself out. It was replaced by a deep, profound calm. The ache in his ribs finally truly faded into nothing. He looked at his fist. He relaxed his grip, his fingers uncurled. The crumpled paper rested in his palm. He walked slowly toward the cast-iron stove. Clara stepped back. She gave him the space. Elias opened the heavy iron door of the stove. The heat rolled out, washing over his face. The orange embers glowed fiercely inside. He held the letter over the flames. He didn't read it again. He didn't hesitate. Implicit action. He opened his hand. He dropped the paper into the fire. The flames caught the dry parchment instantly. The edges curled black. The red wax melted and hissed. The words Vance's name, the $300. The corrupt judge curled into white ash and vanished up the iron chimney. He actively chose to let go. He broke the cycle. He refused to let the trauma of the Prairie Road dictate his future. He burned his vengeance to keep his hands clean for the map. Elias closed the iron door with a solid metallic clank. He stood there for a moment, watching the orange light flicker through the vents. "Is it gone?" Clara asked softly. Elias turned to face her. His shoulders were loose. His hands were steady. He looked like a man who had just set down a boulder he had been carrying up a mountain for 3 years. "It's gone," Elias said. "What did it say?" she asked. Elias looked back at the desk. He looked at the ink vials and the steel pens. "It said your father was a good man," Elias replied. His voice was calm, unshakable, and it said we have a lot of work to do. He walked past her. He didn't grab his rifle. He didn't put on his coat. He sat back down at the heavy oak desk. He picked up his steel-nibbed pen. He dipped it into the black ink. He found his place on the parchment. He lined up the straight edge over the river bend. "Come here," Elias said. "The longitude shifts at the basin. I need you to check the math before I ink the border." Clara smiled. It was a soft, deeply relieved smile. She knew what he had just done. She had seen the murder in his eyes, and she had seen him conquer it. He hadn't just survived the Prairie. He had mastered himself. She walked over to the desk. She pulled up her chair. "Show me," Clara said. Outside, the storm raged on. The wind howled through the Cimarron, battering the adobe walls. But inside the cabin, there was only the quiet, rhythmic scratching of steel on paper. They worked through the night, shoulder to shoulder, mapping a road forward that left the darkness permanently behind. The 11th day broke fast and hot. The morning sun baked the mud into cracked earth. Elias stood on the porch of the cabin. He was shaving with a straight razor, using a small piece of cracked mirror nailed to a post. He scraped the heavy stubble from his jaw. He wanted to look presentable. Today wasn't a day for dirt and sweat. Today was a day for paper and law. Clara walked out of the cabin. She held a heavy leather tube. The brass caps on either end were polished bright. Inside the tube was the map. The final, merged survey, the Whitmore-Thorne line. She looked exhausted, but her posture was rigid, unbreakable. "He's here," Elias said. He wiped the remaining soap from his face with a towel. Clara turned. She looked down the trail. A small dust cloud was moving quickly toward the valley. A buggy with wooden spoked wheels bounced over the ruts. A man in a dark suit sat on the bench, holding the reins tight. Behind the buggy rode 2 men on horseback. They wore tin stars, federal marshals, escorts for the government surveyor. Surveyor Thaddeus Boone pulled the buggy to a halt near the corral. He was a stern-looking man. His hair was gray, his jaw set square. He looked like a man who dealt strictly in facts. He wrapped the reins around the brake handle. He stepped down from the buggy. He dusted his suit off with quick, sharp slaps. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Elias. Then, he looked at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," Boone said. He touched the brim of his hat. It was a polite gesture, but his voice was all business. "I was told I would find you here." "Surveyor Boone," Clara replied. She walked off the porch. She met him in the yard. "You are early. You weren't due until noon. The syndicates in Washington are getting impatient," Boone stated flatly. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. Jebediah Vance's lawyers are pressing the department hard. They want the subsections opened for claim by sundown. If you don't have Silas's completed survey for me right now, the government defaults to Vance's older map. I am here to collect the work or declare it abandoned. He looked at the leather tube in her hands. Tell me you didn't drag me out to this god-forsaken rock for nothing, Boone said. Clara didn't hesitate. She didn't offer apologies for her father's delay. She unscrewed the brass cap. She pulled out the heavy roll of parchment. My father's survey is complete, Mr. Boone, Clara said. She walked over to a wide, flat wooden table Elias used for cleaning tack. She unrolled the map. She weighed down the corners with two heavy iron horseshoes. Boone stepped up to the table. The two marshals stayed back by the buggy, watching Elias carefully. Elias didn't move. He stood on the porch, his thumbs hooked in his belt. He watched Boone. Boone pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket. He slid them onto his nose. He leaned over the table. He was quiet for a long time. The wind blew across the yard, rattling the dry sage. Nobody spoke. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Boone's eyes darted across the paper. He traced the southern grids. He checked the longitudes. He nodded slightly. The southern sections are perfect. Classic Silas Whitmore. Unimpeachable geometry. Then his eyes moved north. To the disputed territory, Boone stopped. He leaned in closer. He pulled a small brass magnifying glass from his vest pocket. He held it over the intricate shading of the canyons. He ran it along the jagged, natural border that perfectly insulated the Cherokee lands. He traced the seam where the two styles met. The flawless lock Elias and Clara had built over the last 11 days. Boone straightened up. He took his glasses off. He looked at Clara. Silas didn't draw this northern topography, Boone said. His voice was sharp, accusatory. The hand is different. The scale is local pacing, not federal chain. The shading is too intimate. A man only draws a map like this if he's walked every inch of it barefoot. You are correct, Clara said steadily. My father surveyed the perimeter framework, but the interior topography was drafted by a local expert. The law requires accuracy, Surveyor Boone. It does not dictate whose hand holds the pen, so long as the federal seal verifies the perimeter. Boone's eyes narrowed. He looked past Clara. He looked at Elias, standing quietly on the porch. You, Boone said. Elias stepped off the porch. He walked slowly across the dirt. He stopped on the opposite side of the table from Boone. Me, Elias confirmed. Boone looked back down at the map. He tapped the heavy black lines surrounding the Blackwood property. Do you understand what you've done here? Boone asked. The sternness in his voice cracked, replaced by a profound, grudging respect. This natural boundary line. It ties the Cherokee grazing rights directly to the underground aquifer. You've created a legally unassailable fortress. If I accept this map, Vance and the syndicates can never touch this valley. They can't claim the water, which means they can't force the small ranchers out. That was the point, Elias said flatly. Boone stared at him. The federal man weighed the politics. He weighed the anger of the Washington syndicates against the undeniable, perfect truth of the ink on the paper before him. Thaddeus Boone was a bureaucrat, but he was a surveyor first. He valued truth over raw political power. Boone reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a heavy brass stamp and a small tin of red ink. The government only respects paper, Boone told Elias, his voice ringing loud across the yard. Explicit dialogue, a massive statement on the nature of history. But today, a cowboy they left for dead just handed minority families a piece of paper that makes them untouchable. You just changed the history of the entire Cimarron, son. Boone pressed the stamp into the red ink. He brought it down hard on the bottom right corner of the map. Twack. The federal seal of approval. It was done. It was law. Clara let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 11 days. Her shoulders dropped. She looked at Elias across the table. Elias didn't smile. He just nodded slowly. The ghosts of the Prairie Road were finally, permanently buried. Boone rolled the map up carefully. He slid it back into the leather tube. He capped it. I'll file this in Mora by sundown, Boone said. He handed the tube to one of the marshals. It goes on the midnight train to Washington. Vance is going to scream bloody murder, but there's not a damn thing he can do about it now. Boone tipped his hat to Clara. He looked at Elias one last time, offering a curt nod of profound respect. He climbed back into his buggy. He snapped the reins. The buggy turned around. The marshals flanked it. They rode out of the valley, taking the new history of the Cimarron with them. Elias and Clara stood alone in the yard. The dust from the buggy settled back into the earth. The oppressive weight that had hung over the valley for 3 years was gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner. Clara turned to Elias. "It's over, no," Elias said softly, looking out at the vast, rugged expanse of the territory. "It's just starting." The resolution came swiftly over the next few months. The Whitmore-Thorne survey hit Washington like a thunderclap. Jebediah Vance tried to sue the department. He brought an army of lawyers, but Boone testified to the map's flawless accuracy. The courts had no choice. The property and human rights of the marginalized settlers in the Cimarron were permanently cemented into federal law. The syndicates packed up their straight lines and their greed and moved elsewhere. Spring arrived in the valley. The snowmelt flooded the creek. The scrub oak turned a vibrant, startling green. The air smelled of wet earth and wild sage. Inside the cabin, things had changed. Implicit action. Clara was sitting at her father's heavy oak desk. She was finalizing the coordinates for a small, independent ranch down south. She hadn't gone back to Washington. There was too much work to be done here. Too many small boundaries that needed an honest pen. She finished the calculation. She set her pen down. She stretched her back. She turned her chair around. She looked across the room. Elias was in the far corner. He wasn't oiling saddle leather or brooding over past wrongs. He was sanding a piece of beautiful, pale ash wood. He had spent the last 2 weeks building a second drafting table. He didn't build it in the dark barn. He built it right here, in the main room of the cabin. He had positioned it perfectly in front of the eastern window, the place that caught the best morning light. He didn't ask her to marry him with a grand sweeping speech. He didn't buy a gold ring in town. He didn't drop to one knee and offer to take care of her. He built her a desk. He recognized that she was a cartographer. He respected her career. He respected her mind. He was giving her a permanent place in his home, not as a housewife, but as an absolute working equal. A romance built on professional respect. Elias blew the sawdust off the smooth wood. He ran his calloused hand over the surface. It was perfect. He looked up and caught her watching him. He walked over to the kitchen counter. He poured 2 cups of black coffee into a matching pair of tin mugs. He carried them over. He set one on her desk. He took a sip from his. "The light's better over there," Elias said, nodding toward the new ash table. "Whenever you're ready to move your brass over." Clara looked at the desk. She looked at the matching coffee mugs. She smiled. It was a deep, quiet smile. She didn't need words. She understood the massive, beautiful weight of the gesture. She stood up. She walked over to her father's heavy oak desk. She began packing away Silas' tools. She put the plumb bobs back in the crate. She didn't need to carry his legacy anymore. She had her own now. She picked up her personal steel pens and her ink vials. She carried them across the room. She placed them on the new ash desk, right in the center of the morning light. Elias watched her set her tools down. He walked over and stood beside her. He looked out the window over the green valley they had saved together. Clara stepped close to him. She didn't shrink herself down. She stood tall. She leaned her head gently against his broad shoulder. "We did good work, Mr. Thorne," Clara said softly. Elias wrapped his arm around her waist. He pulled her close. "We did." "You know," Clara said, her voice dropping to a serious, resonant tone. "We can't fix the past by trying to erase the scars, Elias." She turned her head to look up at him. Explicit dialogue. The final, overarching lesson on trauma and moving forward. "We use those exact scars to map the road forward, so no one else gets left behind on it," Clara declared. Elias looked into her eyes. He felt the absolute truth of her words. His broken ribs. Her father's ruined reputation. They hadn't run from the damage. They had used it to draw a better world. "The road forward," Elias repeated softly. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I like the sound of that." Spring 1879. The sky was a brilliant, blinding blue after a morning rain. The air was crisp. General stood in the yard. The old gray horse looked healthy. His coat was brushed clean. He wasn't wearing a heavy saddle. He wasn't carrying a heavy wooden crate of brass tools. He was just wearing a simple leather halter. Elias stood on the left side of the horse. He was packing a light saddle bag with provisions. Clara stood on the right side. She was adjusting the cinch. They weren't surveying today. There was no deadline. There were no syndicates breathing down their necks. There was just the vast, open stretch of the unmapped Western Territory waiting beyond the Cimarron. Elias finished tying the bag. He looked across General S. Broad back at Clara. She wore her riding skirt and her boots. Her eyes were bright with anticipation. "Ready?" Elias asked. "Ready," Clara replied. Implicit action. They didn't mount the horse. They didn't need to ride. They just wanted to walk. Elias took a step forward. Clara took a step forward at the exact same moment. General the horse stood between them. This time, he didn't refuse to walk. He didn't stubbornly plant his hooves and demand a different direction. He tossed his head, let out a soft snort, and stepped out smoothly between the man and the woman. They walked out of the valley together. Elias didn't lead the way, blazing the trail while Clara followed in his dust. Clara didn't walk ahead, dragging him reluctantly forward. They walked side by side, their boot prints pressed into the soft red mud in perfect, equal rhythm. True love expressed not in words, but in an absolute unshakable partnership. They headed west, into the uncharted territory, leaving the scars behind and taking the map they drew together into the future. The opinions, actions, and decisions expressed by the characters in this story do not reflect the views or beliefs of the author. Certain scenes may contain dramatic situations, emotional conflict, or morally complex behavior, intended solely to serve the fictional storyline and enhance the audience's viewing experience.
And so, the dust settles over the Cimarron one last time. 2 sets of boot prints press into the soft red mud and walk west together, side by side, equal in stride. That image, so quiet, so unhurried, is the one I want you to carry home with you tonight. Because this story was never really about a map. It was about every line we draw in this life, and whether we draw them with truth or with greed. It was about a woman who crossed a brutal country not to conquer it, but to listen to it. It was about a man who had every reason to hate the world, and who chose instead, at the cost of enormous pain, to build something better inside of it. And it was about a father who understood that the most powerful act of love is sometimes the one nobody sees, the one that looks to the outside world like failure. Silas Whitmore didn't lose his mind. He lost his reputation on purpose, so that a man he barely knew could keep his dignity. That is one of the oldest, quietest forms of courage this world has ever known. Real advocacy, this story tells us, is not riding in on a white horse and drawing somebody else's lines for them. Real advocacy is stepping aside, taking the blow, handing the pen to the person whose hand was meant to hold it. And Elias, that broken cowboy, crawling through the mud with shattered ribs, dragging himself to a desk and bleeding onto parchment in the dark. He didn't survive the Prairie Road by accident. He survived it because the human spirit, when it is rooted in justice, is simply harder to kill than the men who try to break it. He taught us that rights are not handed down from Washington. Rights are carved out of the earth by the people who bleed for it, and cemented into law by those who refuse to forget them. Clara gave us something just as rare. She came to the frontier carrying a name, a deadline, and a mission. And she laid every single one of them down the moment the truth asked her to. She let a horse lead her. She let a grieving man stand alone at a creek. She brewed the coffee and walked away. In a world that rewards the loudest voice in the room, she showed us that the deepest respect you can offer another human being is the space to feel their pain without making it your audience. Together, these 2 people taught us that healing is not a single dramatic moment. It is a long, slow collaboration. It is a map drawn in shifts by lamplight, shoulder to shoulder, with ink that sometimes runs dry and must be patiently refilled. It is messy, it is exhausting, and it is the only work that truly matters. So tonight, wherever you are, I want you to think about the blank spaces in your own life. The places you have been afraid to draw. The lines you have been waiting for someone else to give you permission to mark. Maybe, like Elias, you have been sitting on your own map for years, hiding it in a drawer, because you didn't think the world would accept it from your hand. Maybe, like Clara, you've been carrying someone else's unfinished work when it's time to start your own. And maybe, like old Silas, there is a moment coming where the most powerful thing you can do is not add your name to something, but step back, leave the space, and trust the person standing in the dirt to fill it themselves. We cannot fix the past by erasing its scars, but we can use those exact scars to map a better road forward, so that the ones walking behind us don't have to bleed for the same ground twice. That is the Cimarron. That is the truth of it. And wherever the road leads you next, I hope you walk it side by side with someone who earns your trust, one honest line at a time.